right, it's time to make the binding for our tree skirt. So the next step is to get it ready. What I want to explain to you today is how to do a continuous bias binding. A typical binding is cut against the bias, so it's just cut straight, and then you don't have the additional stretch of the bias while you do it. But when we're going around edges and inside the tree, it's nice to have the stretch of the bias binding. So I'm going to show you how to do it, but you can cut it into lots of little pieces, or you can do it so it's all in one piece. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a continuous bias binding. Depending on the width that you prefer, that will decide how much fabric you need to use. And I'm going to give you a little math formula in the blog post, but I'm also going to show to you how I'm doing it. So you need 275 inches of fabric for this particular project. And in order to do that, you need to know how many square inches you're going to get. So if I need 275 inches, and I personally prefer a 2 1/4 inch binding, 275 by 2.25 is 618.75. That's the number of total square inches of fabric I need in order to make my binding. If I divide that by 38, and the reason I do that is because I feel like by the time you actually cut off enough of this, it might not always be 40. This one's a little under 40. So to be safe, I'm dividing by 38 inches. That will tell me how many inches the other direction my rectangle needs to be. And so if I divide by 38, I get 16.28, which I'm going to round up to 17. So to make 275 inches of 2 1/4 inch binding, I need a rectangle of fabric that's 38 inches long by 17 inches wide. If you want to do that with a 2 1/2 inch binding, your number is going to be bigger, and you're going to need 19 inches of fabric to cut yours at 2 1/2 inches. I'm going to cut mine at 17 inches. So I've lined up my edge over here. I'm going to cut. And now I have this almost ½ yard of fabric. Before I do more, I'm going to cut my selvage off. So there goes my selvage. And then the next step is to open up your fabric. So this is where we are going to have a really long tube. We're going to do another 45-degree angle cut. We're going to cut right here, starting from the very corner and going across. And now that means that the edge that I have to work with on my binding is now a bias binding and can stretch. Now you have a couple of options. To just make a bias binding, you could do the same thing that we did before, where you measure 2 1/2 or 2 1/4 inches across, and you just cut, and you end up with all these little pieces, and then you have to also cut here, and you end up with some really short pieces. But you really don't want to have to sew all of that together, and you don't want to have to deal with that bias while you're sewing. So we are going to make a way to do this in kind of a tube. It's a little bit confusing, but it's totally possible. So I have this triangle here, and I have this very long piece now with my 45-degree angle over there. I'm going to take this piece that I cut off from one corner and just pull it across here, so that if I sew it together, now I have one long parallelogram. So I'm going to carefully take these, I'm going to put them right sides together. You can see how I'm going to do that. I'm going to line it up really carefully, and I am going to sew a straight 1/4 inch seam all the way along this seam here, and then I'm going to press it. I'm going to open the seam again like we have with everything else. I'm going to press it with the seam open. All right, so I sewed my seam and I pressed it open, and now I have a very long parallelogram. And what I want to do now is turn it into binding. Now, to make a bias binding, I could, as I said before, just go along and cut, but then I'm going to be joining all of these ends together. So the thing that's nice about making a continuous binding is that we don't have to do it that way. We are going to sew our fabric into kind of an awkward tube so that we can end up having all of the binding come out in one piece. So I like to mark just my very first line. Some tutorials will tell you to mark every line, and if you are uncomfortable and want to do that, go right ahead. That's totally fine. But I like, as I said, a 2 1/4 inch binding. So I am going to measure a line that is exactly 2 1/4 inches from my bias edge, and I'm just going to take a pencil and I'm going to draw a line all the way across my fabric. If you want to, you can continue drawing all the way across and use that as a cut line. I don't prefer to do that, but if you would like to, you can mark all the way across. I only mark my very first line, and I'm going to show you why. So the first thing I do is, if we were to just sew this together in a big tube and make it all line up perfectly, then we would be sewing it into rings and you would cut it off in circles. But what we want to do is we want to have our lines not match up that way so that we can sew them a little bit differently. So what I want to do is I want to have this point, which would be the beginning, my second strip, line up with the end of my first strip. So what I do is I actually cut a little bit into my very first line, my first strip, like that. And that's my reminder that I'm not sewing anything to this. I'm sewing to this because this is the start of my binding. So I'm going to take right sides together and I am going to sew this line to that. I'm going to line my seams up. It's kind of tricky because this turns out to be right on it, but I'm going to line it up with a slight overhang there to accommodate for that. And I'm going to sew a really long narrow tube. If you don't want to deal with something this long and narrow and it's going to feel really awkward, but I promise it's going to work. If you don't want to do something this long and narrow, then when you do your math for your rectangle, you could say, I want my rectangle to only be 30 inches long, but wider. So I'm dealing with a little bit more less of a narrow rectangle. You can do that, which is why I gave you the opportunity to buy a little more binding so that you can play with those numbers to come up with a size you're comfortable with. But this is going to work, the rectangle that goes across your entire width of fabric. So what I'm going to do now, and I'll put a couple pins in just so you can see how I do it. I'm going to start with this point right here, and then I'm going to carefully, even with all of the silly awkwardness of it, I'm going to carefully sew right sides together. I'm going to sew all the way down this edge until I get to the very end of my tube. Okay, so it's not this. I'm cutting this off, and I'm taking the top edge. I'll show you one more time. I started with this. I'm not going to sew this, but I'm going to take right sides together. So I'm going to sew the end of my first strip to the beginning of my second strip. So whereas this would have been the end of the first strip and I would have to just then piece it to here, I'm going to just sew them together right now, but I'm going to sew them together for every strip. And then I'll be able to cut starting at this point and have the continuous bias binding work out. So I'm going to line it up like that. I'm going to go all the way down the seam. All right, here is my tube that I've sewn together. It seems kind of convoluted, but I can put it all the way through, my arm all the way through if I want. And at one end, I've got the overhang because at the original end is the part I cut on. So you can see if I really kind of spread it out that it actually lays now pretty nicely because that seam just sort of wraps around my nice long tube. So here is my continuous bias binding now, all sewn in a tube. I've got the two seams. I pressed the second seam open just like I did the first, and now it's time to start cutting. So if you had drawn lines across everything, you would have lines across, like you may be able to see my line right here, and you could take scissors and you could just cut. Doing that would have meant that you would have needed to carefully align the lines just like we did with our seams, and I don't really like taking the time to do that and pinning all that long seam. So what I do instead, I just go really slowly and carefully around my tube, and I just do this with my rotary cutter measuring. So I started at 2 1/4 inches. This will be an easier direction to go in, and so I see I've got it all lined up here, and I'm just gonna cut, making sure I don't cut into any of this, and then I'm just gonna pick it up and roll it. And it's a little bit slower and tedious because of this, but it sure beats having to sew all those little strips together. When I get all the way around, I will have more than 275 inches of bias binding that I can then use to put on my tree skirt. I'm still carefully lining up my width here of the binding and cutting only like 6 inches or so at a time before I rotate it. So when you get to this point where you're finishing up, you just go around, and whatever's left over here on that little bit is going to just be the extra fabric, because we rounded up an inch to the nearest whole inch when we cut our rectangle earlier. So I'm going to continue all the way around, and I'm just going to be cutting off this little piece here to complete my continuous binding. Just cut that for now, and that is just your leftover strip, and I will carefully unpick this and just take this little piece off here, and there we go. There we have our binding, and it's beautiful. One reason to learn how to do this, other than for a curved edge, is that sometimes you have prints that you'd like to use on a binding that might not be as pretty going up and down or straight across like a stripe. In this case, I turned this script print into a really beautiful diagonal piece, so that rather than either having some words go along here or words go along here, there's just going to be this really pretty kind of diagonal line going on my binding. So I think it's going to look really pretty, and I'm excited to have used this print in a bias binding.